Have you ever had one of those moments where something you thought you knew, like you really had a
It's
handle on
linked
it,
to
suddenly
pyramids
gets
of Giza.
completely flipped around?
Oh, yeah. Those are always fun.
Yeah, it can be exciting, but it can also be kind of unsettling too, right? Like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
That's what happened to me when I started looking into this research that you sent over about the Garden of Eden.
Oh, yeah.
We've all heard the traditional story, right? The Garden of Eden, Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Yeah, the cradle of civilization, right? That's the classic image.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what if that picture that we all have in our heads, what if that's not the whole story?
Mm-hmm.
What if paradise wasn't in the Middle East at all?
Well, that would certainly shake things up a bit.
It would. And that's exactly what's so fascinating about this peer-reviewed study you shared from 2024 by Dr. Konstantin Borisov.
Right.
He basically throws a curveball right into the heart of this long-held belief about the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, he really kind of throws the whole map out the window.
He does. He makes this really compelling argument that the Garden of Eden was actually in Egypt.
In Egypt. Wow.
And here's a really mind-blowing part. Get this. He suggests that the Great Pyramid of Giza could actually be the location of the Tree of Life itself.
Oh, wow. That's a huge claim.
There's a huge EE claim.
Yeah, to relocate Eden to Egypt
Yeah.
and then to connect it with the Great Pyramid and the Tree of Life. That's some serious reimagining of history.
So our deep dive today is all about exploring Borisov's arguments and the evidence that he's gathered.
Yeah, let's dive in.
Okay, so first things first, let's talk about the rivers. Because as you probably know, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are kind of central to that whole Mesopotamian location idea.
Yeah, those names are like the cornerstones of the traditional understanding.
Right. The Bible talks about this single river in Eden that then splits into four. The Tigris, the Euphrates, the Gihon, and the Pishon.
It seems pretty straightforward, especially since we know where two of those rivers are.
You would think so, right?
Right.
But here's where Borisov comes in and shakes things up. He proposes a different set of rivers.
I'm intrigued.
He says that the four rivers were actually the Nile, the Euphrates, the Tigris, and the Indus.
Okay, so he's keeping the Tigris and Euphrates, but swapping out the other two.
Right, so the Nile becomes the Gihon, and the Indus becomes the Pishon.
The Indus, wow, that's a huge geographical jump. We're talking about a river all the way over in India.
I know. It really makes you rethink how the ancients viewed geography, right?
Yeah.
Their mental map of the world was so different from ours.
It really does. And that's one of the key things Borisov emphasizes in his study.
Exactly. He points out that these ancient people didn't have the same precise mapping tools that we have today.
Right, they were working with a different kind of knowledge.
And so their understanding of the world and how these major river
Their
systems
way of thinking
connected
is
was
quite
much more
different.
fluid, I guess you could say.
It was more about the symbolic and mythological connections between these places rather than the exact distances or locations.
Right. And that brings us to the historical map evidence, which is really interesting. Borisov actually uses maps to support his theory.
Oh, really? Now that's something I want to hear more about. What kind of maps are we talking about?
Well, he looks at a lot of different maps, but one that really stands out is the Hereford Mappa Mundi.
Oh, yeah, the Mappa Mundi. I've seen pictures of that. It's incredibly detailed, isn't it? Like a whole medieval worldview crammed onto one piece of parchment.
It is. And, from your own studies, medieval maps weren't exactly geographically accurate in the way that we think of accuracy today, right?
No, they were definitely more symbolic.
But they do tell us a lot about how people in that time period envisioned the world.
Yeah, like what they thought was important and where they thought those important places were located.
And what's so interesting is that the Mappa Mundi and a lot of other medieval maps place paradise at the very top of the map.
At the top. Interesting. So not in the middle where you might expect the center of the world to be.
Nope, at the top. And near a mythical river called Oceanus.
Oceanus, like the Greek god of the ocean.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, Oceanus wasn't a literal ocean in the way that we think of it today.
Right, more like a primordial sea.
Yeah, it was more like this conceptual boundary of the known world.
The edge of everything.
And it was also thought to be the source of all the major rivers.
So all the rivers of the world flowed out of Oceanus.
According to these medieval maps, yes. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
Borisov highlights this map from around 500 BC.
Wow, so way before the medieval period.
Way before. And this map shows just four rivers flowing out of Oceanus: the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Indus.
Wait a minute, that's exactly the set of rivers Borisov is talking about.
It is. Isn't that amazing?
That's a pretty strong coincidence.
It makes you wonder if these ancient map makers were tapping into some kind of knowledge or tradition that we've lost.
It really does. It's like they had a different understanding of the world's geography, and maybe that understanding was connected to these ancient stories about the Garden of Eden.
Okay, so we've got the rivers and we've got these interesting maps.
Yeah, a lot of intriguing clues there.
But Borisov doesn't stop there.
Of course not. He's just getting started.
He also looks at historical writings to back up his theory. And one of the key figures he focuses on is Flavius Josephus.
Josephus. Remind me who he was again.
He was a Romano-Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century AD.
Oh, right. I remember him. He wrote a lot about the history of the Jews, didn't he?
He did. His most famous work is called Antiquities of the Jews.
And that's where he talks about the Garden of Eden.
Yes. And what's so interesting is that Josephus has some very specific things to say about the rivers of Eden.
Well, let's hear it. What does Josephus have to say that supports Borisov's theory?
Okay, so Josephus identifies the Gihon, or Gion, as it was in Greek, with the Nile River.
The Nile. Okay, that lines up with Borisov's idea.
Right, and then he links the Pishon to the Ganges River.
The Ganges. So now we're talking about a river in India.
Yep. Josephus actually puts 2 of the 4 rivers of Eden way outside of Mesopotamia.
That's pretty significant.
It is, and it gets even more interesting.
Okay, I'm ready for the next twist.
Josephus had this whole different way of understanding how these rivers related to Eden.
What is going on?
Okay, so the common interpretation of the biblical text is that there was this one river in Eden that split into 4.
Yeah, that's the usual picture.
But Josephus didn't see it that way.
So what was his interpretation?
He believed that there was this single main river, which he seems to link to the idea of Oceanus, that was the primary source of water for the garden.
So like a primordial river that fed everything.
Exactly. And then this main river would branch out into the 4 rivers that flowed into the rest of the world.
I see. So instead of one river splitting into 4, you have the central source that gives rise to 4 distinct rivers.
That's exactly it.
That's really interesting. And it kind of fits with those early European maps we were talking about, where the world is often depicted as this central landmass surrounded by water.
Right, like everything flows outward from this central source.
Okay, so we've got this whole alternative river system backed up by these ancient maps and the writings of Josephus.
But now comes the really big twist, where Borisov connects the Garden of Eden, and specifically the Tree of Life, to the Great Pyramid.
Oh, yeah. This is where the theory goes from interesting to mind-blowing. I remember when I first read this part, I was like, wait, what?
Right. It's a huge claim. He's basically saying that the Great Pyramid wasn't just a tomb for a pharaoh.
Which is how we usually think of it.
It was something much more than that.
Yeah.
He suggests that it could actually mark the spot where the Tree of Life once stood.
Wow. I mean, that's a pretty bold statement. What kind of evidence does he use to support that?
Well, this is where Borisov brings in some modern science, which is really cool.
Modern science. Okay, now I'm really curious.
So he talks about these computer simulations from 2012 that focused on the King's Chamber inside the Great Pyramid.
The King's Chamber. I know that's like the heart of the pyramid.
It is. And these simulations were looking at the electromagnetic properties of that space.
Electromagnetic properties. I'm trying to picture how that connects to a tree.
I know. It's not an obvious link, right?
No, not at all. So what did they find in these simulations?
Okay, so the simulation showed that electrically charged particles inside the King's Chamber would tend to gather at the apex, like the very top point of the chamber.
So they were drawn to the highest point.
Yep. And when they visualized this in the simulation, it formed a tree-like pattern.
A tree-like pattern? That's wild.
And get this. This pattern had 5 distinct branches.
5 branches. Why is that number significant?
Because, and this is the really mind-blowing part, those 5 branches corresponded perfectly to the 5 relieving chambers that are located right above the King's Chamber.
Hold on. So the internal structure of the pyramid is mirrored in the electromagnetic pattern.
Exactly. It's like the pyramid itself is encoded with this tree-like energy.
Okay, that is pretty mind-blowing. It's like the pyramid is more than just a building. It's almost like a living organism with its own energy flow.
It's an incredible idea, isn't it?
It really is. But wait, there's more, right? Because we're still talking about electromagnetic patterns, not an actual tree.
You're right. So the simulation also showed that when these charged particles interacted with the air inside the chamber, it caused ionization.
Ionization. Remind me what that is again.
It's basically when atoms gain or lose electrons.
Right, right. And what does that have to do with the Tree of Life?
Well, this ionization process led to the release of photons, which are particles of light.
So the King's Chamber would have been glowing.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And the photons were primarily in the green and purple spectrum.
Green and purple. Interesting choice of colors.
Right. And that's where Borisov makes this really fascinating symbolic connection.
Okay, I'm all ears.
He interprets this emanation of light, especially in those specific colors, as a possible representation of the tree of life radiating energy.
So he's seeing this electromagnetic phenomenon as a kind of visual metaphor for the tree of life.
Exactly. It's like the pyramid is generating this tree-like energy field and then projecting it out in the form of light.
That's a pretty powerful image.
It really is.
So Borisov is basically pulling together all these different threads. Ancient texts, historical maps, and modern scientific simulations.
He's weaving a whole new narrative about the Garden of Eden.
A narrative that places it in Egypt, with the Great Pyramid as a kind of energetic beacon.
Exactly. And, when you think about it, 2 of the 4 rivers mentioned in the Bible, the Gihon and the Pishon, haven't been definitively located in Mesopotamia.
That's true. There's always been some debate about those 2.
So it leaves room for these alternative interpretations, doesn't it?
It does. And Borisov's theory, while certainly bold, isn't completely out there.
Right. It makes you wonder if we've been looking in the wrong place all along.
Maybe we need to shift our perspective.
Exactly.
Instead of focusing on Mesopotamia, maybe we should be looking at Egypt and the Great Pyramid in a new light.
Exactly. What if the Great Pyramid wasn't just a tomb, but a gateway to paradise?
Wow, that's a pretty profound thought.
It is, isn't it? It makes you rethink the whole story of creation and the role of ancient civilizations.
And it makes you wonder what other secrets might be hidden in plain sight, just waiting to be discovered.
So to sum it all up, Dr. Borisov's research
That's a question
really
below
challenges
for
our
you.
assumptions about
Comment
the Garden
on
of
it.
Eden.
He makes a compelling case for an Egyptian location, with the Great Pyramid as a potential marker for the Tree of Life.
And he does it by bringing together all these different pieces of evidence.
From ancient maps to modern science.
It's a fascinating blend of history, mythology, and scientific
Yeah.
inquiry.
And it leaves us with a lot to think about.
It really does. And it makes me wonder how our understanding of ancient civilizations might change if more people started to take this theory seriously.
Yeah, what if we started to see the Great Pyramid not just as a tomb, but as a symbol of paradise?
It would definitely change how we view history, wouldn't it?
It would. And maybe it would even change how we view ourselves and our place in the world.
Maybe.
It's definitely food for thought.
It is. And it might be worth taking another look at those ancient maps or revisiting some of those old texts with this new perspective in mind.
You never know what connections you might discover.
Exactly. Who knows? Maybe paradise is closer than we think.
Maybe it is.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Dr. Borisov's fascinating research.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring
Thanks.
and keep questioning everything.
That's the best way to learn.
Absolutely.
And who knows, maybe we'll stumble upon the Garden of Eden ourselves one day.
I'll bring the sunscreen.
Sounds good to me.
See you later.
See ya.